Good morning, everybody, and welcome to week 3 of Race and Religion in the History of American Presbyterianism, led by Dr. Bruce Douglas. This week's class focuses on desegregation, and I'll let Bruce describe the details.
I am telling a story in this series of presentations, and we're about halfway through the story. I've talked about Presbyterians, American Presbyterians in the time of slavery. I've talked about American Presbyterians in the epoch of segregation, which I defined last week as the 1880s through the 1950s. And now today I want to focus on an era which actually only begins in the 1950s and 60s, but there's so much to talk about in the 1950s and 60s that I'm going to characterize this as the beginning of the process of desegregation. I'll say at the outset that I think we're still living through that era for what I hope are in this crowd, this group, are obvious reasons. Before I get to that, however, I want to comment on a few of the issues that were raised in the chat last time. Very good questions. And I just want to briefly note a couple of points about them. There was obviously a great deal of interest in the group last week in my comments about mainline Protestants, including Presbyterians, playing an active role in the education of former slaves in the aftermath of Reconstruction in the South. And I simply want to augment what I said last time by saying the following. If you look carefully at the history of these institutions, and there are really quite a number of them, especially when you add the colleges to the universities, overwhelmingly they were founded by two kinds of institutions. They were founded, many of them, by government, or the federal government, or in some cases state governments. But they were also founded even more by Protestant denominations. And the ones who took the lead in this were Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. They took the major role. And I was asked in the chat whether this was simply a white initiative, and certainly it was not. It was collaboration between whites and blacks. Very often, the whites providing much of the money, and then blacks taking the ball and running with it. It was also pointed out in the chat, and I think it's right to say there were Jewish forces that contributed to this, and some of you may be aware of a new documentary on a famous Jewish philanthropist named Julius Rosenwald, who contributed a lot of money. He was I think a CEO of Sears and Roebuck at one point, and he provided a big amount of money to the whole project of education of blacks in the South. Second thing I want to comment briefly on is a question, an issue that was raised by Jack Calhoun that I think is a very interesting and important thing to talk about. Jack, in the comment that I saw in the chat, raised the question of whether the theology of segregation, to which I referred last time, was somehow something that was sort of seeded by ideas from the North that then flowed into the South. And I would say yes and no to that. It was certainly the theology of segregation was something that drew upon racist ideas that had been current in both North and South, but really never found direct expression in a theology of segregation as such in the North. That was a Southern creation, Jack. And it was designed, especially in the early 20th century, to defend Jim Crow legislation. I was also asked, what about Black theology? And I simply want to say, it's coming. It's coming today, as a matter of fact, and I'll talk more about it in the sessions to come. Finally, Adrian Steele raised an obvious question and a very important question, and that is, well, what about Lewinsville Presbyterian? What was the response to all of these developments in Lewinsville Presbyterian? And my own knowledge of the subject is very limited, and I want to tell you all that I had a long conversation with Gary Pinder this week about this topic, which augmented my knowledge somewhat. I will talk about that more next week. So hold fire, Adrian, it's coming. And this series of talks would be remiss if you didn't at some point talk about Lewinsville. So with that having been said, let me now go to the subject of the day, which is, as I indicated, desegregation in the 1950s and 60s. In talking about this phenomenon of desegregation, I think it's important to justify talking about the dates that I've focused on, the 1950s and the 60s. Why say that it begins then? There were intimations of desegregation earlier, but I want to say the real push came, the beginning of the push came only after the Second World War. If this were a university course and there were time to talk about it, I would want to go into what I think was what it was about the Second World War that brought this into focus in the post-war period, but I'll have to bracket that for the time being. Two things in particular signal the beginning of the process of desegregation. One is, and I've already alluded to this at the end of my remarks last time, in 1948, the desegregation of the US military by executive action of the president, Harry Truman. And I've already said, let me just say it again, that set in motion a ferocious debate in the United States Congress with an organized opposition from Southern senators as a bloc. He had wanted to do this through Congress by congressional action. It was not possible. It proved not to be possible. And keep in mind, most of those senators were Democrats, maybe all of them were Democrats of his same party, but they resisted stoutly. And so he took executive action and set in motion a process which, needless to say, took a long time, and it fell to Eisenhower to really move this forward in the years after Truman. But that set in motion the whole thing. And by the way, as I said last time, getting twisted over my tongue, that set in motion Dixiecrats, Strom Thurmond, and that whole phenomenon, which was triggered by the desegregation of the military, at least the beginning of that. And then the second thing, and the most important thing of all, really to get the country alert to it. The desegregation of the military alerted the country somewhat to this issue. But the thing that really made it a public issue that people were talking about all over the country was the Brown decision of the Supreme Court in 1954, the Warren Court, of course. And of course, that had to do with public education at all levels, I want to stress, not just primary and secondary education, but higher education as well. And it said flatly, this is one of the reasons why it's such an important case in the whole history of this topic. It reversed just directly the Plessy versus Ferguson formula, you recall, that said separate could be equal. In the Brown decision, it was stated flatly, and there was a whole argument developed around this that separate was not equal, and that was empirically a fact. There was just no doubt about it in the minds of people who studied the matter. It was not equal, and therefore the court mandated a process of desegregation. And let me just say parenthetically, that process of desegregation is still going on, and it still arouses profound resistance all over the country. That's why it's somewhat of a kind of a euphemism to say the desegregation era is the 50s and 60s. In the sense, it's the 50s and 60s on into, well into the 21st century. That decision handed down by the court set in motion yet another fierce opposition in the Congress. This Southern bloc of senators declared it unconstitutional and organized what quickly became known as a massive resistance. Organized statewide opposition to the desegregation of schools and all that entailed. And by the way, it applied, as I said earlier, to higher education as well as primary and secondary education, and that provoked, even at the level of higher education, trying to introduce Blacks into especially public institutions of higher education, provoked an outroar and in many cases violence. And it's just terribly important to grasp that where there were steps made, like in Little Rock, Arkansas, to insert a few Black kids, 2 or 3 Black kids into a public high school, it provoked riots. And we all have, those of us of a certain age have in our minds images of these white mobs attacking the kids in that situation. And that gave rise to, of course, a debate in the federal government about how to enforce this thing. And Eisenhower in particular was deeply troubled about it, deeply troubled about the idea that this would be somehow forced on the South. And he was very reluctant to send troops, but of course in 1957 finally did. That was, I would say, continued that resistance to imposing this policy. And I'll just say parenthetically, I don't think there's any other way to make it happen. That's a very important thing to grasp here. There are people who say to this day that desegregation would have happened without federal action. I think that's fantasy land. I think this is a very this in a microcosm raises a profound issue of our constitutional system. Could there have been desegregation, especially desegregation of public facilities, without federal action? My own view is no. John Kennedy, I think mainly for political reasons, was in his own way every bit as resistant to that, but finally was forced to take action. Now, I said at the end of my remarks last time that if something else had not happened, I think that fierce Southern resistance, white resistance, of course, I'm not talking about blacks, that white resistance. If given that white resistance, I think if there had not been something else take place, it probably, as a result of all the things I've talked about, the desegregation of schools would have fizzled. It would have been something on paper, which probably eventually people would have found their way around, even in the courts. Frankly, as they eventually did anyway. But in the beginning, it was very clear that there was a contradiction between what the courts had mandated and what was the actual practice. Now, what did happen to suddenly change the equation was the following. In the mid-1950s, and I think historians looking back have to say, even though we take it for granted, this was kind of an extraordinary thing. What emerged was an active, aggressive, but nonviolent attack on segregation from another quarter, not from the courts, not from the federal government, but from poor blacks in the South, led by the church. Let me say that again. Poor blacks in the South, led by the church. Now, it wasn't an accident that it happened. It had been very carefully orchestrated. Sometimes we think of a figure like Rosa Parks as somebody who just decided one day to not move to the back of the bus. Well, Rosa Parks had been selected strategically to play that role. And the active organization here was the NAACP, which very carefully organized this opposition. And of course, we have that famous incident, dramatic incident, in which she refuses to go to the back of the bus. That whole symbol of the back of the bus is kind of a marvelous sort of capturing of the whole logic of segregation. She refuses to go to the back of the bus. She is jailed for it, and there's a whole then set of court procedures, cases that begin to emerge out of it. But what also emerges out of it is the famous, and I think this is a kind of sort of watershed moment in the development of my topic here, the Montgomery bus boycott. Because the Black community responding to this, and the Black community is very important to the sort of the financial model of the public transportation in there. They engage in a boycott because of this this action taken by Rosa Parks and others who followed in her wake. And that led to the emergence of a young Black clergyman as a leader in Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr., who just arrived there a couple of years earlier from a long period of theological study. He had completed theological study for the doctorate at Boston University and came down and assumed this pastorate. And in this situation, he is a young Black guy, is clearly identified as somebody who's got leadership potential, and he's catapulted into the leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott. At the same time that this happens, and again, for many of us, this is kind of ancient history that's coming back up in our minds. Here are the other things that happens. There's a kind of initial complimentary response to this, mainly from white, but not entirely white college students in a couple of places in particular. One is Greensboro, North Carolina, and there are sit-ins at the counters. And of course, that's a challenge to segregation on another front, these segregated facilities at the lunch counter. You can't have whites sitting next to Blacks. And another place that it happens is Lynchburg, Virginia. Let me just call your attention to the following fact: the very place where eventually Jerry Falwell emerges. And it's no accident that these two things happen in the same place. there is a famous sit-in at which a whole series of mainly white girls from Randolph-Macon Women's College, but also some blacks and some there are some males sprinkled in there, are engaged in a sit-in, get arrested, and suffer a lot of bad consequences as a result of that. One of them, famous leader in the Methodist student movement, got thrown out of Randolph-Macon Women's College simply for that one act. This begins to ripple. There are more and more of these boycotts and sit-ins and so forth. And what begins to emerge is a whole, and sort of, I don't want to suggest that all of this is neatly planned, but they're kind of strategic jumps that are made. The emergence of something called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, headed by King, and a whole series of figures. Jesse Jackson and others are part of this, but King is the main man in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is made up entirely of black clergy, Southern black clergy, who, by the way, were looked down upon by the urban black intellectuals in the North rather consistently. And then, in addition to that, the organization of a really famous other organization in the history of the civil rights movement called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by a young theological student. He actually was an undergraduate who was studying theology, named John Lewis. And they are pursuing this sort of together, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and SNCC, as it was called, and they worked hand in glove. Now, as far as I've been able to piece together, one of the most important questions that arises in all of this is, to whom exactly are you appealing other than the federal government? Because they clearly were appealing to the federal government for assistance. But King in particular, and I want to stress that King, in my reading, is a very devout man, a deeply spiritual man. He also was a kind of political thinker, but he was a deeply spiritual man. And I think if you read his writings, you'll get a sense of that, especially not only his public sermons, but even more his sermons in the context of a church. King hit upon the following idea, in part because he had this whole experience of interacting with clergy, fellow clergy, and the theological students in his experience in the North. Let us appeal to the churches. Let us appeal to the churches. He called the churches, and it's very interesting to think about this language and maybe how a little bit antique it is. He characterized the churches as the conscience of the nation. And of course, he was talking mainly about the white churches. By the way, keep in mind that the letter to the Birmingham jail was a letter essentially to other clergy, white clergy, who told him to stop it, slow down, you're going too fast. So King hits upon two things. One, let us try to make as much as possible this whole phenomenon a public spectacle that will be appealing to the media. And boy, was that a decision of genius. He quickly began to figure out that the more press conferences you had, the more advance notice to the press that there's going to be civil disobedience you had, the more likely it was that the whole country would begin to become aware of it. And then he issues a public appeal, very public appeal to the churches. Please help us. Please help us. And especially as they got into difficulty, as they began to, King spent a lot of time in jail. I read somewhere an article where somebody figured out all the number of days he'd spent in jail. And it's a long, long time that he spent in jail. And needless to say, jail was not always a pleasant place to be. I'll just leave it at that. So, and he suffered violence in jail. So you get this very public appeal to the white churches. And lo and behold, and I hope against the background of what I've said before, you'll understand my tone here. Lo and behold, they responded positively. My goodness. They didn't brush it off. They didn't say, well, we'll file that or we'll take it under advisement. They said very quickly in the early 1960s, it took a year or two, but in the early 1960s, especially as the issue was posed directly, you need to help us. Many of them, and I want to stress here, I've already talked about the ecumenical movement, above all, the churches that were actively involved in the National Council of Churches. The ecumenical movement played a crucial role in all this. The churches that were involved in the ecumenical movement, which had that history that I talked about in the previous session, stepped up to the plate, and they stepped up, if I can now raise my voice a little bit, with a vengeance. so much so that ultimately it became a cause of great stress within the churches. I've already mentioned churches that played a crucial role in the development of Black education in the South. To some extent, those same churches continued to play a leadership role throughout the following period. But I want to mention four in particular that were right sort of shoulder to shoulder in this battle: the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Methodists, and the Congregationalists on the white side. Those four. And there were certain figures who began to become important public figures, that is, in the wider consciousness of the nation, because of their leadership in the churches. Bishop Pike, for example, in the Episcopal Church, and a figure who became a kind of larger than life figure in Presbyterian circles, the stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church, a man called Eugene Carson Blake, who eventually became president of the National Council of Churches and executive director of the World Council of Churches. Those figures in particular just stood up and said, this is the right thing to do. By God, we've got to do it. We've got to do it. And here's what they did. Not only did they issue pronouncements, I mean, all churches can issue pronouncements, that's a big deal, but they then did a whole series of other things. They created commissions which were well staffed, a commission that is a kind of like an executive or body within the church. Commission on Religion and Race in the National Council of Churches, Commission on Religion and Race in the Episcopal Church, Commission on Religion and Race in the Presbyterian Church. And very often, very important for me to add, these commissions on religion and race were staffed by Blacks. Very important thing, which elevated Blacks into positions of leadership in the struggle. And by the way, this is a turning point in American, not only religious life, but public life, because for the first time, Blacks begin to play a role as dictating the terms of the forward advance, as opposed to being treated as second class or third class citizens. I want to mention two names there in the Presbyterian case. One is a man called Edler Hawkins. I've mentioned a few Black leaders before, and I want to mention him. He becomes the first Black moderator of the Northern Presbyterian General Assembly in 1964, kind of major development. A Black man finally elevated to that position. And then somebody named Gay Wilmore. I'll say that again. Gay, the larger name is Gay Road, but he went by Gay Wilmore, Wilmore, who became the director of the Commission on Religion and Race for the Presbyterians. Gay Wilmore becomes a very important figure in the rest of the story that I'm going to be telling here. But the other thing you need to know about him is that he was Gary Pinder's teacher at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. When Gary Pinder went to seminary, I asked Gary, one of the questions I asked him was, well, where did you begin to get this sort of consciousness? Gary was a kind of civil rights activist, believe it or not, for a certain phase in his life. He actually sat in. He was participant in the first sit-in that took place in Worcester, Ohio, when he was a college student at the Woolworth counter, because Woolworth had this set of stores throughout the South that were known for segregation. And Gary started his career, you might say, as a civil rights activist. And one of the reasons he went to Pittsburgh Seminary was because of this man, Gay Wilmore, who at that time was a young academic teaching social ethics at Pittsburgh Seminary. Now back to my story. Not only did they make pronouncements, but they organized efficient instruments for implementing the policy, which had a lot of money behind them. But they did something which was extraordinary. They put a call out to clergy throughout the nation to, and this was the phrasing used, put your bodies on the line in this struggle that's going on in the Deep South. And in the middle of the early 1960s, there were two summers in which better than 400 clergy, almost all white clergy, interestingly enough, went from places outside the South to participate in voter registration campaigns in the South. Some of them lost their churches. A couple of them lost their lives. You can imagine the sort of the undercurrent of violence in voter registration in the Deep South in Mississippi in this period. The other thing, and this in a way is, some respects, the most important, there was a steady drumbeat of appeals to congregants all over the nation not just the Presbyterian, but these mainline Protestant denominations, a steady drumbeat of appeals to people in the pew to support the pressure for appropriate legislation at the federal level. And I've already said that when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was finally passed, Hubert Humphrey, who was the floor manager for the legislation, said rather openly, said it several times in several different places, this legislation would not have passed had it not happened, had it not been for the support of the churches. And I don't think he was being complimentary there. I think he was being descriptive. There are all kinds of people who were somewhat skeptical about the role of churches and things like this, who conceded that the mobilization campaign, the letter writing campaign, the activity that was generated by Presbyterian lay people like ourselves in relation to the pressure on members of Congress to legislation was a very important influence. I don't want to say the only one. Labor unions played an important role as well. There were several other bodies that played an important role, but that legislation passed in no small part because of the work done by churches. That leads me to mention the obvious thing. Once the ball got rolling, keep in mind, we started in 1955, we're up to 1964. By 1964, you finally get the passage of a truly landmark piece of legislation, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That was followed throughout the 1960s by a whole series of other pieces of legislation, which all had the following effect, basically dismantling the legitimacy of segregation. Let me summarize it. Dismantling the legitimacy of segregation, a whole elaborate set of laws and policies that had been developed in the segregation era to codify, in effect, segregation as part of federal law and, of course, state law. All that was attacked directly, frontally, in everything from voting rights to housing, public accommodations. It was all changed as a result of this legislation. And by the way, the voting on the legislation followed almost completely regional lines. It was almost totally opposed in the Senate, for example, by Southern Democrats who were sort of representing well, they thought, the interest of their constituents, and almost exactly reverse in terms of numbers from outside the South. Now, the final thing I want to say on this part of my remarks is the following. None of this would happen had there not been a rather fundamental shift in public opinion throughout the nation, not in the South, but throughout the rest of the nation with regard to the legitimacy of segregation. And students of public opinion have well documented this, that something rather fundamental changed between about 1955 and 1964-5 with regard to the public opinion of whites in this country with regard to the legitimacy of segregation. It was a kind of, when you think about it, the enormity of what was involved, a kind of glacial shift, moving from one set of attitudes toward the other. What was accepted as normal, things I talked about in the last presentation, in the early 1950s, by whites in Illinois or California or whatever, was no longer accepted as legitimate, and segregation came to be looked upon by the people outside the South as a kind of backward policy, kind of associated with kind of regional backwardness of the South. And that, in turn, leads to eventually more fundamental changes in the South itself. I would argue that what happened in the period between 1955 and the late 1960s, mid-1960s in particular, as a change in the mood of the country, but equally in the behavior of the churches and their relationship to the wider society, as something comparable to the pre-Civil War era. There had been nothing comparable to it up to the lead up to the Civil War, and especially with regard to the churches. The churches stepped up, stepped up, if you will, and took an aggressive role in relation to the wider society, and their action made a difference. The story I'm telling in this part of the series, however, is only one part. The story I've been telling has two parts, and I've only told you the first part The second part I'm now about to go into has an utterly different quality to it, an utterly different feel to it. Because in the latter part of the 1960s, the mood in the wider nation with regard to segregation became much more complicated. I've said that there was a shift that took place. The shift did take place. It endured to some extent, but things began to happen in the later part of the 1960s that complicated the picture enormously. The mood of the country with regard to race relations changed. You might say almost in the flick of an eye. Between about 1964 and 1969, very brief period, the whole picture gets different and I would say cloudier for the following reasons. And again, for some of us in this room, the things I'm about to cite are things we all remember, but let me go through them just to remind you of what happened in the late 1960s that really clouded the picture. One thing that happened was the following. The school desegregation issue, it quickly became evident, was not just a regional issue, it was not just a Southern issue. School desegregation in the South was a matter of public policy. It was a matter of, in the most explicit sense, law. School segregation in the South was a matter of law. It was a matter of public policy. It was actually vigorously enforced. Outside the South, it was not the case. I've already indicated that I grew up in a town in Southwest Ohio where there was no formal segregation, but boy, was there informal segregation. And I've heard from some of the rest of you saying that's exactly what it was like in Chicago or some other place that you came from. Now, what began to happen in the late 1960s is that it became evident that that 1954 decision had implications not just for cities in the South, towns in the South, but also places like the town where I grew up, and Detroit and Chicago and Boston, and on and on. And the more that happened, the more it became evident that there was going to be a different kind of resistance, but comparable resistance outside the South to the resistance that had already developed in the South. And de facto segregation, as it came to be known, came to be something which many white people in outside the South came to defend. They would defend it on somewhat different grounds, and they would vigorously think about the riots that broke out in several northern cities with whites acting to defend what they characterized as the neighborhood school, and that the phrase that comes from that period is forced busing. We're opposed to forced busing. Of course, there was other kind of busing going on, but forced busing became a kind of symbol for something which people, not just in the South, but people in other parts of the country as well, resisted. And of course, then that raises questions about, well, if you're really opposed to segregation, what about your own town? And so forth. The second thing that happened in this latter part of the 1960s is that the civil rights struggle began to evolve into something much broader, and in particular, the civil rights struggle, which was focused mainly on, we all know well what that was about, legal barriers to freedom of movement, freedom of action on the part of Black populations. The struggle began to focus on, as Martin Luther King himself and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and to some extent SNCC, began to move outside the South. King in particular insisted that they needed to take on the economic problem of the Black population. And they went to Chicago and a whole series of places organizing something called the Poor People's Campaign. And King insisted that the problem of the Black population is not just access to a lunch counter, it is jobs and so forth. It is access to neighborhoods that are not segregated, not redlined. And so there develops in the North very quickly, as the civil rights struggle becomes, if you will, not only just a civil rights struggle, but an economic struggle, a kind of active, shall we say, ambivalence initially, and then overt opposition to the movement that King leads. And he himself confesses in his writings that the problem that is faced by the Black population outside the South is so much more complicated and so much more difficult to deal with. Keeps appealing to the federal government for help, but the mood is changing clearly as, you might say, the pressure is put on northern cities in particular. And then, of course, it becomes evident that the Black population in these northern cities and western cities, for that matter, I'm thinking of Los Angeles, the Black population is made up of people who are somewhat different from these mainly poor rural Blacks that have formed the shock troops of the civil rights struggle in the South. Urban poor, in particular, in the cities, become a sort of different clientele, if you will, for the activity of King and those who support him, like the Urban League and others. But there's a kind of friction that develops very quickly between the civil rights leadership and a figure like Mayor Daley, for example, in Chicago, and the political situation in those places becomes much more complicated than it had been in the South. A third thing that happens is that there is a challenge rather soon as the movement develops into the late 1960s, a direct challenge to the leadership represented by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. On the whole, in the South, they were in charge. They and SNCC were in charge and could pretty much dictate the terms of the struggle. But something begins to emerge among Black leaders in the latter part of the 1960s, under broadly the rubric of a new term that appears in that era: Black Power. Black Power. People who are not committed, that are activists, in some cases well-credentialed activists, who are committed to certainly advancement of the cause of the rights of the Black population, but are not committed to the nonviolent philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. And furthermore, are not committed, are very critical of his very strong insistence on the only way to solve these problems is by Blacks and whites working together. Our goal is an integrated society in which we live together in harmony. There's an adversarial edge to Black Power thinking, which challenges King, and some of the leaders of that tendency. I think the most radical version, of course, is Malcolm X, who mock King and challenge him for leadership of the Black movement. And then, if that were not complicated enough, then we get, starting in 1965, a series of urban riots, big riots. Los Angeles, Watts, Newark, eventually Washington, D.C., a whole series of riots that break out. And the fascinating thing is, if you look at these riots in any detail, you see that many of them, this is before, I want to stress, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., but before the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and subsequently the assassination of Robert Kennedy, which in some respects had a strong effect upon the morale of the Black population in this period. Even before the assassinations took place, there were the Watts riot was 1965. That was several years before King was assassinated. And if you look carefully at it, it bears an uncanny resemblance in some respects to things we've been living through in the last year or two. Because the thing that triggered the Watts riot was allegations of police mistreatment of Blacks. There was just an insistence on the part of the people who ultimately defended the actions taken by Black militants in the riot, that the thing which got this ball rolling was a whole series of misbehaviors on the part of Blacks and on the part of the police, which led to deep Black alienation in the ghetto. But the other thing, even more interesting, is historians looking at this say the background to the Watts riot was a serious action on the part of conservative political forces in California to try to undo the efforts that were being made to eliminate redlining in housing policy. And I'm sure all of you understand the policy of redlining, but that's the instrument through which segregated housing was maintained outside of the South. And there have been efforts made in the early 1960s in California to try to do away with that. And then there was a referendum, a public referendum that reversed, with strong public support for the referendum, that reversed those efforts to eliminate redlining. And that was created a kind of mood in the Black community of growing hostility to the white population, and frankly, sort of a sense that maybe the white population is not so sympathetic to our interests and our needs as we originally thought. Anyway, you had a season of these riots, and let me stress, it wasn't just one or two, it was dozens of them. And they took place not just in major cities, but for example, I'm sure as we hear the story of Joe Biden more and more, there will be a reference to the fact that there was a rather nasty riot in Wilmington, Delaware. Gary Pinder told me before he came here to Washington from his previous pastorate as an assistant pastor in Dayton, Ohio, in the period where he had been there in the 60s, there had been a rather difficult riot that had taken place, which strained enormously the relations between white and Black pastors, let alone the wider population that took place then. So you have a kind of, shall we say, explosion of violence in the form of riots that take place in the late 1960s. And then, of course, to top it all off, you have the Vietnam War, which all of this is taking place against the background of increasing opposition to the Vietnam War on the part of many people. But one of the things that happens is that the leadership of the civil rights movement generally, not all, but generally takes the position of being opposed to the war. And King himself becomes, in the very last year or so of his life, becomes a rather outspoken critic of the Vietnam War. Now I'm winding up to throw a punch, and here comes the punch. This did not, all the things I'm talking about, which changed the mood rather fundamentally in the country, complicated the issues of, shall we say, the civil right raised by the civil rights movement. It complicated the issues enormously. It did not seem to, and I'm kind of surprised about this, it did not seem to give rise to any serious second thoughts on the part of these church leaders who had been foursquare in defense of the civil rights movement earlier in the 1960s. But it complicated enormously their task. It complicated enormously their task. They're trying to mobilize a church to be supportive of the cause of civil rights and to support Black leaders as they pursue that cause. And it complicated it in a way which is even beyond what I've already said. And now I'm going to go into that. What emerges, as I think, as a direct response to the events I've been just describing is the following. The emergence in every one of the denominations which were front and center in this struggle, the emergence of Black caucuses in all of the major Protestant denominations. The Black leaders in one church after another begin to form a Black caucus. And of course, the fascinating question is, why would you need a Black caucus? And that, by the way, those caucuses have existed ever since. They've existed now for half a century. Among the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Anglicans and so forth. And those Black caucuses are drawn to something which is emerging rather powerfully in the theological seminaries, and that is a Black version of liberation theology. Now, in the last session we had, I mentioned earlier, one of the queries in the chat had to do with the issue of liberation theology. Well, here it comes. Black power theology, if you will, but I'm going to characterize it more as Black liberation theology, begins to emerge as a serious force in American church life in the late 1960s. And I would have to say, in response in part to the developments that I have just been discussing. Now, I'm almost embarrassed to dance over this topic so quickly, but I have to, but I want to stress, what does that mean? What is Black liberation theology? If you want one name to hang it on and you're interested in pursuing this at all, and by the way, I'm going to get that bibliography to you this week. It'll be posted online. But there's a famous book called A Theology of Black Liberation by a man named James Cone. C-O-N-E, who taught at Union Seminary in New York. I would say this liberation theology, which picks up, by the way, on themes that had already been developing in Latin America at the same time, Latin American liberation theology. This, if you will, appropriation of those themes to tie them to the Black experience did two things, both of which I want to stress were rooted in the theology of the Black church long before this ever appeared. Let me say that again. There was implicitly in the developing thought and practice of the Black churches that I discussed a lot last time, a kind of theology, a distinctive theology, which up to this point had been kind of marginalized and largely unknown in the white world. Well, people came to know it in this period because of Cone and others. And by the way, because of Gay Wilmore, Gary's teacher, Gay Wilmore, who becomes a very strong proponent of this kind of theology in the Presbyterian world. It has two themes. One, the famous theme of liberation theology, that the fundamental theme of the Bible is liberation to the captives. Let me say that again, liberation to the captives. And if that rings true and you think I've heard that before, you have heard it, and you've heard it quite often at the Lewinsville Presbyterian Church from the pulpit. Liberation to the captives. The fundamental concern of God in this world is above all the status of the marginalized, the disinherited. That's one of the big themes of Black theology all along. The Black theology has historically strongly emphasized the Exodus as a sort of revelation of God's nature. And then, of course, the other theme, and these two things are wedded together in this kind of theology, social justice, liberation and justice, liberation and justice. Now, I'm getting to, I think, something very important here. What do we mean by justice? That word rolls off the tongue easily. What exactly is meant? Well, in the minds of the proponents of Black liberation theology, it meant the following: reparations. Let me say that again, reparations. And that word was used pretty explicitly in the late 1960s, but it was not a new idea. I want to stress this goes all the way back to the time of the Civil War, because the fundamental theme of this, you might say, Black movement all along has been the following. In the time of slavery, we were wronged. Something was taken from us without our consent. We were wronged. We were victimized, and we are owed repayment. We are owed repayment. This is what justice means. So in the late 1960s, in liberation theology, Black liberation theology, you get a very explicit emphasis on that. And then in Black liberation theology, you also get the following idea that the church, if it really does what it claims to be, it should be leading the way in the pursuit of the delivery of those reparations. And they're talking about economic reparations. They're not talking just about something symbolic. The Black power movement generally was about reparations, but the ecclesiastical version of it focused on the responsibility of the church in delivering on that promise. And that resulted in demands, very specific demands on the churches, and the creation of something called the Black Economic Development Conference. The Black Economic Development Conference, which had as its leadership a lot of secular figures, but also a lot of church figures, people who were typically in these Black caucuses. The Black caucuses plus a variety of other people from Black, independent Black organizations came together in this organization created in the late 1960s. And they specifically challenged, in a very overt way, they specifically challenged the churches to take up this cause and pursue it. There were very direct actions, including in some cases sit-ins at church headquarters, and a famous incident that took place at Riverside Church in New York, where James Foreman, who was one of the leaders of this movement, directly disrupted the service and demanded time to talk about the need for reparations in relation to the Black population. This was front page news. New York Times covered it extensively, and the following happened. This challenge went out to all of the major religious communities, not just the mainline Protestant denominations, but the Roman Catholics, the Jewish organizations. There was a challenge to all of these religious organizations, which had kept saying over and over again, we believe in the cause of Black emancipation. We believe that rights, Blacks have rights that have been denied. It's time. They've been saying all those things. And so, if you will, the challenge to the churches and synagogues was put your money where your mouth is. Well, it was a kind of a shocking moment, late 1960s and early 1970s, but in particular, late 1960s. Some of the religious bodies that were directly addressed by this brushed it off and kind of mocked it. The Southern Baptist Convention mocked it and said, "Oh, are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. Who are you to tell us?" The Roman Catholic hierarchy on the whole brushed it off and said, we're not particularly implicated in this. Jewish organizations on the whole did not respond very positively to it. But the ones that did respond to it sympathetically were, predictably, the ones who'd been involved in the civil rights cause earlier in the decade. And I've already named them. And in each case, they directly took up this challenge in their judicatories, and there were extensive deliberations about how we should respond to this challenge. James Forman, who was, as I say, the most militant, the most active exponent of these ideas, was invited by Gay Wilmore to address the Presbyterian General Assembly in the late 1960s, and did. And it was shall we say, a very contentious meeting. At the end of the deliberations that took place in these denominations, none of them, not one of them, acceded directly to the demands of the proponents of reparations, not one of them. What they did instead was to create funds within their own church life to promote some of the same objectives. Presbyterian version of it was the Presbyterian Development Fund, which was designed to provide capital resources for Black enterprise in the 1970s. I'll go into this more next week. On the whole, this aroused, and I'm about done here, this whole affair, shall we say, the reparations affair, aroused exactly what you would expect, which was a lot of tumult and opposition in the pew. In the Presbyterian world, in the Methodist world, in the Episcopal world, in every single church where this conversation had broken out, there was ferment, and the ferment typically, not always, but typically took the form of, how dare they? What business do they have telling us how to use our money, or how to operate in that way? That, however, I have to say, was the white response. The Black response, typically, was the opposite. The Blacks in the church, these Black caucuses, one after another, said, absolutely, this is exactly what should be happening. We are owed reparations. It is time for the churches to take responsibility for this. And some Black leaders said, we are very good. Well, some, Gay Wilmore in particular, said, we Presbyterians are very good at raising money to build our own buildings. We build great cathedrals. We build all kinds of stuff. Now it's time for us to use that capacity of raising money and channel it in a direction which is not so self-serving. That's pretty sharp language. The Black leadership in the Presbyterian Church, on the whole, in responding to this circumstance, where ultimately the leadership of the Presbyterian Church said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do it in the way, at least, that you have asked us to do it. The Black leadership was very, very disappointed and ultimately became rather alienated. Gay Wilmore left the office of the Commission on Religion and Race, pursued academic career subsequently, but in his later writings expressed profound disappointment with the inability of the church to respond positively to this challenge. Now, I've got one more episode to add to this so that you understand fully the situation that would emerged in the 1970s, which is my topic next time. I want you to put your hands up. How many of you have heard the name Angela Davis? Wow, this is a very well-educated group. The Angela Davis affair is a very distinctive Presbyterian part of the story. It didn't happen elsewhere, and it really is a kind of, you might say, culmination to the developments that I've just been talking about. In the early 1970s, we have the Angela Davis affair in American Presbyterianism. Angela Davis was a Black intellectual, philosophy professor at UCLA who had been a student of a Marxist philosopher named Herbert Marcuse, who at that time was a really very fashionable figure in the student movement world. She was a Marxist, and she was a, shall we say, Black Panther sympathizer, Black Panther movement there in California. She had been raised, by the way, in San Diego and had roots in San Diego. I'll get back to that in a second. She was arrested in 1970 for complicity in a shootout which took place in a courtroom where some Black Panther militants were being tried. They tried to take control of the courtroom by violence. And apparently some of the weapons at least could be traced to her. And so she was on the FBI most wanted list for a while she was in flight, eventually arrested, brought to trial, ultimately found not guilty, but it was a very, very celebrated case in the period we're talking about. Now, in the middle of all this, there was created the Angela Davis Defense Fund. And a Presbyterian church in San Diego, where she had been raised, she had friends in this church, and they appealed to the General Assembly for financial support for her defense. And the people who were involved in administering the religion and race program decided to make a contribution to that defense fund of 10 grand. Today, it doesn't seem like much, but it was enough of an amount to cause, and of course the symbolism was huge. And it was public knowledge. The denomination announced that they were doing this. They were making this contribution to the Angela Davis Defense Fund. They indicated they thought she was wrongly charged, and they basically believed in the causes that she espoused. That created a furor in the denomination, a furor. And of course, it was publicized widely, not wildly, but widely, by conservative forces in the church who'd been opposed to the civil rights stuff all along, actively opposed to it. And they took this as a kind of moment to be able to make their case that this whole effort towards involving the church in this very public issue of civil rights had been wrong-headed. There was real pressure on the denomination to rescind this gift of $10,000 to her fund. That did not happen, but something else did happen. The leadership of the Black Caucus made it very clear that they favored this action. They thought it was the right thing for the church to do. They were deeply disappointed that there was even a question as to whether or not the church should rescind that money. And as a result of that, the leadership of the Black Caucus took up an offering from its members to provide $10,000 to repay the church out of their pockets so that the church would not be embarrassed. And of course, the word embarrassed was used in a very ironic way. It was a kind of, the very fact that they raised this money was a symbol of their own deep disaffection from the leadership of the church. And more broadly, the disaffection from the mood that was developing in the church, which was so skeptical of that action. Now, I want to suggest to you that that situation, the Angela Davis thing, and all the things I've been talking about now, ended up creating a very, very different mood in the church than had existed at the time of the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Fundamentally different mood, a mood in which the Black leadership of the church, at least in that period, was profoundly alienated from the denomination. They didn't leave the denomination, but they made it very clear that they were very unhappy with the failure of the denomination to carry through on its commitments that it had been made, that it had made early in the 1960s. Now, all of that is only preface to the story I'm going to tell next week, which has to do with the emergence of a very different mood in the country. The mood in the country in the 70s and 80s was, as we all know, very different politically, but also in terms of churches, very different from what it was at the time of the Angela Davis affair. And as the church entered that period, the 1970s, it was clearly divided on the issue of race in a way that it had not been in most of the period that I've been discussing today. So I'm done. I can probably, Kathy, do we have any time left or not?
We could probably take just a few minutes. I will quickly summarize some points of information that people pointed out, and then there are a couple of questions. So because the military was a much more universal experience, military desegregation was really important. That's one point. Another is the rise of segregationist academies or ways of segregating within public schools as a way of keeping segregation. I think, unfortunately, many of us know that if a school has the name Christian in it and was founded in the South sometime in the 60s or even 70s, the chances are that it's part of its mission was maintaining segregation, which is really bad association, but that is the way it works. And then somebody recommended the Color of Law, which many of us have read, and I'm sure will show up on the bibliography at some point on redlining. The two questions, and maybe we can take them now. I'll leave it up to you. One is, what was the role of CORE? And then another sort of bigger one, which probably goes to next week, is given the rise of the nuns, the NONES, the unaffiliated with a church, what effect does that have on our present civil rights movement, I guess we could call it, and the role of the church? So those were, I think, the two questions. CORE, which might go quickly to this week, what was the role of CORE? And then maybe the rise of the nuns sounds maybe like something that would fit into next week.
I'm going to duck both questions because they will take me far too long to discuss. So I will pick those up in the next session. And next week, we're going to be talking about what I've characterized in the outline as the reaction. I've already begun to get into the reaction, but there is a much more expansive reaction that develops after the tumult of the 1960s. That's what I'll be talking about next week.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We will
Thank
see
you.
everybody next week.